All right, got 5 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. We're on Lesson 9, if you've got your handout booklets with you, which is starting Daniel chapter 5. Lesson 9, Daniel 5. Let's go to God in a word of prayer before we begin class. Our Father and God, we're thankful for the day that you've given us, for the beautiful weather we're enjoying, and so thankful for the chance that you've given us to worship you this morning and to assemble together to study your word tonight. We ask that you help us to have open hearts and minds to your word, that we would be aggressive students of your word, that we would grow closer to you and to learn all of the lessons you would have us to learn, to be the people that you would have us to be. It's in your Son Jesus that we pray. Amen. All right, so I'd like to thank Ryan for filling in when we were gone last weekend. I've heard from a few people he did a great job. Give him a thumbs up, thumbs down. I'm kidding. I'm sure Ryan did a great job.
He had 3 really good pictures.
3 good pictures, okay. His came through. But thanks, Ryan, for filling in. I wish I could have been here for that class. That's a lot of good stuff for us to apply. Tonight's going to be a little bit the opposite. We're not going to do much in the way of application tonight. We'll make most of the applications from this chapter on Wednesday night. So this will actually be a little bit more on the history and archaeology side of things, just as a little bit of discussion about Belshazzar, because I found it very interesting. We're going to talk about that. Probably Jonathan and I are the only ones who will find it interesting, and you'll be bored, but that's okay. I think it is. I talked in the first class about some of the proofs that we have of when Daniel was written, and this is one of the strong ones. There's several that are very strong, but this is one of them. So I want to spend a little more time just digging into it tonight, just to solidify. I talked about a lot of this stuff in the first class. We'll go in a little more depth tonight, and then what we'll do after that is get into the beginning of the chapter, and then Wednesday night we'll kind of finish up the details of the chapter, and then talk about applications that we can make from that. But as we go through a book, I think it's helpful. Sometimes we kind of get caught in where we're at. I think it's always helpful to go back and talk about what have we covered and where we've been. So just kind of thinking back, chapter 1 was when Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and the others were taken captive, and they were put on trial. Remember that as a test, and they didn't want to defile themselves. Daniel purposed in chapter 1, verse 8, not to defile himself, and that led to them actually being wiser and better than the others because God blessed them in that. Chapter 2, what was that? Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream about the statue, right? And we talked about what that means, but the kingdoms that were to come. So it was prophecy, things that are all history at this point in time, but it was prophecy of some things to come, with Nebuchadnezzar being that head of gold. And in chapter 3, what did he build? He built a golden statue and told everybody to bow down to it, and that's with the Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego in the furnace that they were thrown into because they wouldn't bow down to that. They wouldn't obey the government and defile themselves. And then chapter 4, which we just covered, was Nebuchadnezzar's humbling, right? Where he was basically turned into an animal in his mind, and so he lived like an animal, and then he was restored to being the king in all his glory, and he made a proclamation very strong about God. And so I know you talked about that on last Sunday and made some applications from that. So that's just kind of a little backdrop to where we are now. So if you look on your handout, you'll see the kings of Babylon. I put final kings, but I think Nabopolassar was really I believe the first one that was a kind of a king of Babylon. But Nebuchadnezzar had a long reign, and then Amel-Marduk, or he's recorded as evil Merodach in Jeremiah and 2 Kings. And you see just a succession of kings. Labashi-Marduk was less than a year. He was an infant, and then Nabonidus was the final king of Babylon that's recorded. There's a long list there, but if you look at the time frame, look from the end of Nebuchadnezzar, 562, to the beginning of Nabonidus, 556. You got 6 years. So there was a lot that went on in that time frame, and then Nabonidus reigned the final 17 years. So he was listed as the final king of Babylon. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But let's think for a moment about why the date of writing matters. And we talked about that in the first lesson. So somebody that doesn't believe in God or doesn't want to, you've got this book that we're going to come into a lot of prophecies that are unbelievable in some of their detail, some of the things that are prophesied ahead of time. So somebody that doesn't want to believe in God or believe the Bible, what are they going to have to claim? It was written later. It had to be written after the fact for somebody to write this stuff. You can't write it beforehand because nobody can do that unless there was a God, and they concluded there's not. So it's important for them to prove that. But I think it's important for us to prove the opposite, right? If we can prove that it was written when it claims to be, then it builds our faith immensely, that there's no question about the time of writing. So we're going to talk about some of that tonight as part of what we're covering. So One of the big criticisms of the book of Daniel, there have been a few that we talked about in the first lesson, but one of the biggest ones for a long time, for a couple thousand years almost, was that there was no record of a Belshazzar. No record of Belshazzar at all. And so people would look at the book and say, "That's just, that's it's bogus. There's nothing in history about it." It's interesting now, if you go online and look up who is Darius the Mede, which we're going to see at the end of this chapter and talking about the next chapter. He was recorded as the one who was over Babylon when the Medes and Persians took over, Darius the Mede. If you look online, you're going to see a lot of things that say he's a fictional character recorded in the book of Daniel, because there's not any record of a Darius the Mede that we found in history. There's some people that we believe is who that was, and Darius was a title name, but that's what you'll read online now. If there had been an internet a couple hundred years ago and you'd looked up who was Belshazzar, that's exactly what you would have read. He's a fictional character in the book of Daniel because there was no record of him anywhere. But then in 1854, let me kind of show you the timeline here, kind of what we were talking about just a minute ago. So Daniel started here. 539 is when the Medes and Persians overthrew. So this event that we're studying today and Wednesday night, happened in October of 539. And so Daniel, bad adapter here. I'll pull it back up in a second. So just as a side point, I told you guys I updated to iOS 18 on my phone, and it's apparently not compatible with the Lightning to HDMI. That's just I think it's one of the things they programmed into it. Maybe it's just technology. But so I upgraded my phone, so I bought a couple adapters. I got the Apple adapter, which is really expensive, and I bought an off-brand, and that's what I'm using as the off-brand right now, and I think I'm going to have to switch to the Apple. Anyway, so 539 is when these things happened, so Daniel recorded them sometime after that. But in the later things that we'll see over the next few chapters, he talks in great detail about some of the things that happen right in here. And so people that don't want to believe the Bible want to say that this was written by a Jew in the 2nd century back in here in the 160s. Can you guys see that okay in the back that time? Okay. So they want to say it was written in this time frame right here. We talked about that when the Dead Sea Scrolls they were actually found in the early 1900s, but some of those were written in the 1st and 2nd century. All of them were the actual copies of the ones of Daniel were actually all written after this stuff right here, but very shortly afterwards, within less than 100 years. So the Dead Sea Scrolls don't prove that Daniel was written before that, but because they were copies, they were kind of archives, it's hard to believe that they would have accepted as canon and written in copies of it in 50 years or so after these events, because he talks specifically about some things that happened in 163 when we get to chapter 11. But one of the stronger points now is Belshazzar, so we'll talk about that a little bit. Herodotus, who recorded in the mid-5th century BC, so he was writing in the 400s right here. That's when he recorded history. So he's less than 100 years after this stuff. He didn't mention Belshazzar. He didn't know anything about Belshazzar. And so the fact that there was a Belshazzar was lost to history by this point right here. Daniel records it. Nothing was uncovered about Belshazzar until 1854. And in 1854, this cylinder was found that names Nabonidus and Belshazzar, both. So suddenly we've got proof that there was a Belshazzar. And it says that on this, there's a prayer for long life and good health for Nabonidus and, quotes, for his eldest son, Belshazzar. And Belshazzar was described on that as the firstborn son, the darling of the heart. So it proves that Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus, Nabonidus being the last king. There was another one translated in 1924. So sometimes these things are uncovered, but it takes a long time to actually go through and interpret everything that's on it, because not everybody can read all of the ancient Aramaic that's on there. But in 1924, there were oaths and legal documents that were sworn in Belshazzar's name. And the form at that point, we have our legal documents where you may have a notary on it, or there's different forms in different states depending on what your legal document is. But in that era, the legal documents were sworn in the name of the king. And so that would have been a standard form. There were oaths and legal documents that were sworn in Belshazzar's name. I'll mention a few more of those in a minute. There were also cuneiform tablets. These are in the Yale collection. Some cuneiform tablets that were discovered in the mid-1800s and made available in 1929. And there's text on it that says, "For the favor of Nabonidus, king of Babylon, my lord, and for the favor of Belshazzar, the son of the king, my lord." So there's proof Belshazzar existed. For a long time he was claimed he was a fictional character, but there's proof he actually existed. But all of the cuneiform evidence states that he's the son of the king. It doesn't actually call him king. What does Daniel call him here? Verse 1. Belshazzar the king. So nothing actually says in the documents that have been uncovered. And when I say documents, I'm talking about mostly things written in stone. It's not documents on paper the way that we would have those. But none of it calls him the king. But Daniel in chapter 5, verse 1, and chapter 8, verse 1, and also 5:30 refers to him as king of the Chaldeans. So stepping back, just using our what we know about the way that term Chaldeans is used, what would be a logical possible assumption? Could Belshazzar be king of the Chaldeans, but not king of the whole empire? Is that a possibility? Because Chaldea was a regional area, right? It was the area around Babylon. So that's one possibility. Belshazzar's reign is noted in Daniel 7:1, and then it refers to it being the first year of Belshazzar's reign. And then in chapter 8, verse 1, it talks about it being the third year of Belshazzar's reign. So it's talking about a reign. It puts him in position not as just the son of the king, but as a king. But all of the things that we have in archaeology, the cylinders, the tablets, they refer everything and date everything to Nabonidus. They don't date things to Belshazzar the way Daniel did. And they called Nabonidus the king of Babylon, but it never dates it relative to Belshazzar's reign. So there would still be critics who would say, well, Daniel got it right that there was a Belshazzar, but he doesn't really have it right that there's a king, so that he was the king, so there's a fault in it. Again, when we look at that timeline, Daniel had to have written it when he claimed to, because he knew that there was a Belshazzar. Nobody knew that. Even within 100 years of that time, Herodotus had lost that information. But there is some further evidence that's been uncovered in the last 100 years or so that does show that Nabonidus entrusted the kingship to his son. So he was still formally the king, but he entrusted Belshazzar to actually kind of run things while he was away. There's some evidence that he left Babylon and went to Tema, which is in the northwestern Arabian desert. So if you think on a map, it's going to be northwest from where they are, about 500 miles away. And that was the last 14 years of his reign. So his reign was 17 years. The last 14 years, he just disappeared and left Belshazzar in charge. So this is the Nabonidus Cylinder and Nabonidus Chronicle. The Nabonidus Chronicles state that from the 7th to 12th years, the army was under the command of the son of Nabonidus. So that's actually stated on the Cylinder and Chronicle. The army was under the command of the son of Nabonidus. The Persian verse account of Nabonidus, which is a separate cuneiform document, I don't have a picture of it, but that's published in 1924, that reports that Nabonidus entrusted the army to his eldest son, let everything go, entrusted the kingship to him, and went to Tema and took residence there. So now we're starting to uncover evidence that actually, even though Belshazzar wasn't formally the king, he was left as the king by Nabonidus when he went away. There are separate reports that Nabonidus offended the people of Babylon. If you look at the final kings of Babylon again, Nabonidus, so Nebuchadnezzar is the son of Nabopolassar. Amel-Marduk is one of Nebuchadnezzar's sons. Nergal-Sharezer, the next one, is Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law. Labashi-Marduk was Nergal-Sharezer's infant son. So we've got a kind of a bloodline there. Even though one of them was a son-in-law, it's a family line. But look at Nabonidus. He killed the infant son, and he was of the priesthood of Babylon. So he wasn't part of the royal lineage. He killed the infant son, married Nebuchadnezzar's daughter to legitimize his throne and claimed the kingship. So he was a king who wasn't of that bloodline. He was also, though, as I mentioned, a priest. So the official god of Babylon was Marduk. And he was a priest of Marduk, but he apparently preferred their god Sin, S-I-N, to Marduk. And so he was trying to push that and promote that. And he fell out of favor with the people because of that, and especially with the priesthood. And so that's reported part of why he went away, because there was a temple to Sin in Tema. And so he went there and kind of whatever was going on with that aspect of it, and left everything there because he had offended the people and wasn't supported by the priesthood. So that's reported separately in some other documents that have been uncovered. So Belshazzar performed the important functions, some of them regal, while Nabonidus was in Tema. But it's noted that he never took head of the religious festivals. So there was an annual festival to Marduk, a big festival, and so that it was the king's responsibility to be in charge of that. He's the king; it represents the god. But it's reported that Belshazzar never did that. So he was the king, but he wasn't the head king in a sense. He was working as king, but he didn't run those festivals. That was left to Nabonidus, and it was considered a privilege as well as an obligation for only the king to do. So that's a little bit of background that would show that he was actually filling in that role. So we actually do have proof that he functioned as a king, even though he was not officially the king. So now you can maybe see why Daniel would refer to him as the king of Babylon, even though the official documents wouldn't record it that way, because he wasn't officially the king. He'd been left in that place by his father. So some further points. It was common practice, as I mentioned, for legal documents to be sworn in the name of the king. And there are some oaths that were taken in the names of both Nabonidus and Belshazzar, which would again support both of them reigning at the same time. So there have been some legal deeds uncovered from 543 and 542 BC, with the parties swearing by Nabonidus and Belshazzar. And that's not been found with any other of the Babylonian kings. So you go back through all the previous kings, no documents have been uncovered to date that would swear by a king and his son, only the ones that have been found with Nabonidus and Belshazzar, which again supports Belshazzar reigning as king. There are also 3 published inscriptions of business transactions of Belshazzar for purchasing wool, leasing a house, and loaning a sum of money that are dated from the 5th, 11th, and 12th years of Nabonidus' reign. And the one from the 11th year is for money that was due to Belshazzar for the purchase of garments, and the collateral was the purchaser's house, a slave, and property, and there was interest due, and it refers to him twice as Belshazzar, son of the king. There are also records of the royal delivery of tribute, so taxes, that were noted as closely associating these two guys. So there's a whole lot of supporting proof that's been found that he was actually in a reigning position as king, even though he wasn't officially the king. So let's look at, I gave you a few questions on here. There wasn't a whole lot for you to do other than reading the text for this, but question 1 asks you, how is the historical record of Belshazzar being a co-ruler with his father Nabonidus, how is that supported by what we read in chapter 5 here, verse 7, verse 16, and verse 29? Yeah, third position. So if if Daniel meant him as the head king, he would have been second, right? But because he offers Daniel the third position in the kingdom, it means he recognizes he's not first position right now. So that goes along with what history has actually uncovered. Which again, going back to how would Daniel know all that if he didn't write it at the time? Because nobody even knew who Belshazzar was after that, let alone that he wasn't actually officially the king, that he was functioning as a king and was second in command. So that really is strong support for the time of writing. So he had great authority, but it was delegated authority. So he's titled as king, functioning as king, but he wasn't formally the king. All right. So Daniel in this chapter and the queen both refer to Nebuchadnezzar when they're talking to Belshazzar as your father. But Belshazzar was Nabonidus' child, and so that's another thing that people have looked at sometimes and said, this is a flaw because it's not the father. Nebuchadnezzar is not the father of Belshazzar. So I gave you a few explanations on here, possible explanations. You want to tell me what you think of those? What are some possible explanations for why Daniel and why the queen would refer to Nebuchadnezzar as Belshazzar's father? Yeah, they called Abraham their father. And who's that guy? And what do we call him? The father of our country, right? Or forefather. We call him George Washington, we do, but we also call him the father of our country. So, and they use that term the same way. Anybody that was in the lineage of rulership would have been called father. They did it with Abraham. They would do that in the Babylonian culture. The Medo-Persian culture would have done the same thing. Yes? I don't know the answer to that, but yeah, sometimes son would include anybody in the lineage afterwards, but I don't know if there was a specific term for grandson or not. I do well to speak in English properly, let alone Aramaic, so sorry I can't help you on that one. So one possibility is just that he was like a forefather, that they were related. What are some other ones, looking just at the marriage aspects of what happened there. Who did Nabonidus marry to legitimize the fact that what he thought was fact that he was king? He married Nebuchadnezzar's daughter for sure, and probably married the widow also. So we know from the archaeological findings that he married Nitocris, who was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, and there's some implication that he probably also married Nebuchadnezzar's actual wife, the widow, and so that's probably who we're talking about when we talk about the queen here, and we'll come to that more in just a moment. That's probably actually the widow. So there's a couple of family ties there that would have made it actually a closer family tie to Nebuchadnezzar in that sense. So there's some family ties. Probably the strongest thing is just that Nebuchadnezzar was the father of their country, and he's still known as that. When you talk about Babylon, you talk about Nebuchadnezzar. He'd built Babylon to its glory, as we talked about in the last chapter, and he was representative as the father of its leadership. So he was a bloodline forefather, and he was also kind of a generic forefather. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did that because I was curious, because I had looked up Darius the Mede just to see what people said. And literally, there's multiple things that say he's a fictional character from the book of Daniel, but everything records him now as factual because there's so much archaeological evidence. There's still critics that will say that there's mistakes here, that it's not the father and things like that, but that's kind of been done away with. Although, if you read in books of people that are anti-biblical, they'll still say that that's false, but I think part of that's based on not really understanding the archaeological findings, because so much of that's been reported more recently as things have been translated. But online, at least, I didn't see anything that stated that anymore. Okay. Anything else about that before we move into a little more of the storyline? Mm-hmm. Head of gold. Yeah. He was kind of a representation of that whole portion of it, yeah. Yeah, and really, in a sense, also fits with his dream in chapter 4, because he was the tree that provided food for everything, and the kingdom was great under him, and all the things that happened. And we'll see as we kind of go through this chapter, especially on Wednesday, that there was a decline in the kingdom and its wisdom and strength greatly from the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Anything else on that? So sorry if that was boring to you. I just found it very fascinating that there's so much uncovered that proves what Daniel states in this chapter, that for so long people said that's a bunch of bunk. There's nothing about it anywhere in history. Well, what's been uncovered has proven that. I kind of anticipate if we came back in 200 years, we'd be saying the same thing about Darius the Mede. There'll be more things uncovered that actually show us that one of the other characters that we'll talk about in the next chapter is actually Darius the Mede. We just haven't uncovered the things that actually stated as that, because that's a kind of a title name. Yes, Jim? Yeah, right. And that's been proven over and over with lots of things. Jim? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, absolutely. For us who believe, for somebody who doesn't believe, they're going to not want to believe Jesus either. But yeah, if we're going to believe Jesus, you have to believe the prophecy of Daniel, because Jesus did. Otherwise, Jesus is a fraud as well. Excellent. All right. So let's talk about not too far here. Let's talk about the party a little bit now. So how many people are at this party or festival or feast, depending on the translation you have? Yeah, it says 1,000 lords, right? So how many people do you think were there if there's 1,000 lords there? More than that, and probably at least double that, right? And you'd probably think more than double that if you think of most parties. If you've got the lords there, you've probably got at least one other, plus one, as we would say today. So there's probably 2,000 to 4,000 people there. This is a massive party. I mean, it's a really big to do. So I mean, just put yourself in that situation with all the people there. So again, a little bit more history to bore those of you who don't like history. But Herodotus and Xenophon, who are both Greek writers, both record that there was a feast held throughout the night at the time of Babylon's fall. which goes along with this. So they record actually this particular feast, even though they're not recording it from a Bible standpoint. And they say it was facilitated by the citizens drinking and making merry. Babylon's fall was, which would go along with what was happening here. So very possibly, because of what they recorded, it wasn't just limited to what was going on in the royal palace. It was actually a citywide celebration, and this is what happened inside the palace, what we're seeing in this chapter. There's evidence from Persian history that Cyrus marched on Babylon in September. They've used different months, obviously, but in our September and October of 539 BC, that Nabonidus was defeated and then fled the scene. And it was speculated by some that when he fled, Belshazzar declared himself the king, and this was kind of his own coronation party. I think most people think that's probably not accurate, just because he still refers to giving Daniel third in the kingdom, and he didn't consider a second. There's better evidence from the cuneiform writings that, as I mentioned a minute ago, Nabonidus was trying to replace Marduk as the chief god with the moon god Sin. And after 10 years in Tema, he returns to Babylon in 543 BC, and then he worked actively to try to promote the worship of Sin above Babylon's god Marduk. He even tried to convert the temple of Marduk to a temple for Sin. He encountered fierce resistance from the priests of Marduk. And again, remember, there's been 10 years that they haven't had their primary festival every year to Marduk, and so they're already very oppositional to him coming back and doing that. There was what's called an Akitu festival to honor Sin in the city of Haran that was devoted to the worship of this god. It was celebrated on the 17th of their month Tashritu, and that was the date that the city was captured. So it's possible that he had actually incorporated this worship to this moon god Sin, and so this was maybe the first big festival for that. That's one possibility. Because of the lunar calendar that the Babylonians use, so they have a intercalation month periodically to match the solar year. This date correlates with the time immediately following the hunter's moon or harvest moon, so that's when the moon is full moon, rises, and is in the sky the whole night. And so it occupies the sky the whole night, and that would be when they would have a feast to the moon god. So that actually matches of the possibility of this being a feast to the Sin, the moon god. So it's possible that was part of what was going on. However, it also correlates with an annual New Year celebration that Nebuchadnezzar had instituted. And that was a celebration of a renewal of the palace for another year. So it happened to fall at the same time also. So there were several different festivals that might have been happening around this time, or maybe they were celebrating all of these, and so that's part of why the whole city was celebrating, as recorded by Herodotus and Xenophon. So there were several things where there could have been a big celebration going on outside of the palace as well. Herodotus also further records that the Babylonians had already been further defeated outside of the city of Babylon. They had all retreated inside of the city walls, and if you'll recall from what we talked about in the last class, it was a huge city, had a double layer of walls around it, had the river flowing through it, they had all kinds of supplies, so they're thinking, we're good, no siege is going to take us, because they could be in there for years and years and years and years with all the supplies that they had, so they believed they were impregnable. So they were inside, in a sense, mocking the siege that was going on outside the city. So there's a lot of things going on, maybe that other social and civic things that would have added to the festivities of what we're reading about here inside of the palace. So back to what's recorded specifically here in Daniel 5, what does Belshazzar command then at the feast? So you've got all these people there, 1,000 lords and all the other people there with him, and what does he command? Bring in all the vessels from the temple, and we want to drink wine out of those, right? So that's what he commands. And if you could look back in Ezra 1:9, that records that there were over 5,400 objects taken from the temple, mainly goblets and basins of silver and gold. So that's the kind of things that he was talking about. There's a lot of different items that they could have brought in there to drink out of. So question 2 asks you, why do you think Belshazzar wanted everybody there to drink from the temple items in Jerusalem? Doesn't tell us why, but why would he do that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it would show that you're above all those things. So that's an aspect of pride, right? Do you think that was a normal thing? And I don't expect you to know this, but do you think that was a normal thing for the governments and the people in that time to do that? I'll tell you, it wasn't, apparently. Everything that's recorded would say that they were afraid of offending those gods. And so they would respect those items, they would protect them and keep them. They conquered them and took them, and that showed their superiority and their God's superiority. But they didn't want to offend those other gods and cause problems, so they wouldn't do something like this. So this actually even goes against the things that their culture would do. I mean, this is showing an intense amount of pride and arrogance to do that, even in their culture. Jenny? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And it's possible he chose other ones too. That's not recorded here because this is the story relative to God and the Israelites. So it's possible he chose other ones, but he specifically did choose these, we're told. So he wanted to have these to drink out of. And yes, he would have known, should have known the things that have happened. We'll come back and talk about that in just a minute. But clearly, it was recent enough that he should have known all the things that had occurred with this God, Yahweh, the one that he's offending here by what he's doing. So arrogance and pride seems to be the biggest reason. The other reason would be, what were they doing already? What did they use these vessels for? Drinking wine. So they're getting kind of drunk, right? And so there's not reason and common sense there because they're already drinking wine, and his wisdom is actually escaping him already, whatever little bit he would maybe have at this point in time. But there's an overt disdain that's being displayed here for the God of this God that they had conquered in their mind. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, he's wanting it for everybody there. So there's also, if you think about it, what's going on outside of the city right now? They know this is happening, but what's going on outside the city? There's a siege going on. I mean, they're being attacked by the Medo-Persian Empire, and they're inside, and they're there's just thumbing their nose at the God that they think they've conquered from Jerusalem. So it's, in a sense, they're saying, all these people out here don't have a chance. Look at what we've done. And so it really is just a display of disdain and arrogance and pride. So what does it say in verse 4? Who were they praising? Yeah, so who would that be? And it's going to be Marduk, Sin, any of the other gods that they claimed allegiance to, right? The ones that they had the temples to. I think I said when we talked in the last chapter, there were 53 different temples set up around the city of Babylon, if I remember correctly. But they had a lot of temples set up to Marduk and to other gods, and so those are the ones that they would have been praising. So they're thumbing their nose at Yahweh, and they're specifically praising these other gods of theirs. So what happens next in verses 5 and 6? We all know this story. We've all heard this one before. But God shows himself. How much of himself does he show? His hand. I mean, that makes it even scarier, right? That's kind of freaky if you just think of seeing a hand writing on the wall. I think it's interesting. It actually says that it wrote on the plaster of the wall. And I hadn't thought about this until we were in Israel last summer, but because typically when you see ruins, you see all the stones and everything that are stacked up. But when we were at Masada, we got to see part of Herod's palace there. That there was a room that still had the plaster on the inside of it that had been protected from the sun, and it was a really fine, smooth plaster and had painting on it that still had the colors there. It was beautiful, and it just made me think that's probably what's happening here. They've got beautiful plastered walls, a lot better than our drywall things that are put up because it's all hand done. So it's going to look more like the ancient European plasters that when we would tour someplace there. So it's this beautiful plaster, probably decorated, and then there's this hand that appears writing on the wall. What's the physical impact on Belshazzar? His knees were shaking and he grew pale and his hip joints were loosened, right? There's not a lot of things in Scripture that are funny, but that's one that maybe I shouldn't, but I kind of find that funny just because it describes him after he's so proud and arrogant that he goes to the opposite extreme. One of the other ones that I think is funny is when Moses fled from the snake, and I would flee from the snake too, but just the fact that it was his rod and God changed it into a snake and it says he fled from it. So that just strikes me as humorous. This one does in a sense too, just because it's kind of, you see him getting the response he has to how brave and proud he was being just a moment before that. So what's Belshazzar's request and the reward? Verses 7 through 9. Yeah. I want somebody to interpret it, and I'm going to clothe you in purple and gold, make you the third ruler in the kingdom. So the wise men couldn't read it or interpret it. Why do you think that was? I mean, the language is actually kind of a structure of the Aramaic words. So why do you think they couldn't interpret it? Because Daniel comes, I mean, obviously we know Daniel's inspired, but. So one possibility is maybe they didn't want to speak bad of the king. They don't really know what it means, but they're certainly not going to make something up and speak bad of the king. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So it's probably more a sense, and we'll talk about it more as we talk about the meaning in the next class. But it's probably more along those lines that they could probably read what the words were, but it didn't really make sense. So it'd be like what you said if it just said, king party class. It's just like, what's that mean? I don't know how to interpret that. It is possible they couldn't even read it. That maybe the structure of the lettering, it was something they couldn't actually read, but certainly they couldn't interpret it. And it's interesting when we get into it, and we'll talk about it more in the next class. Daniel reads it as nouns when he reads what it says, but when he interprets it, it's verbs. So it is a meaning that he's interpreting, and not just literally, here's what it says. He's actually assigning a meaning to what those words actually are. But the king is troubled, his guests are astonished, confused, perplexed, depending on which translation you have. So we'll talk about the queen here, and then after her, we're going to wrap up and finish the rest of the class on Wednesday. So who is this queen?
My question is this. The queen knew about Daniel,
Mm-hmm.
so she must have been an older person because she was back in the time of Belshazzar.
Yeah.
Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
So
she's...
was this his mother? You know what I'm saying? The queen?
Yeah, so probably it was actually the queen mother. So if you look back in the beginning, so there's some, we don't know for sure, so let me just say that first of all. We don't know for sure who this is, but there's a little bit of a difference. The word used in verse 10 for queen is Malchida, and that is like a queen. It's not one of Belshazzar's wives that he would sleep with. If you look in verse 3, where it says the king, his lords, his wives, and his concubines, the wives there is a different word. And so he's got wives and concubines, and then there's the queen. So it's possible she was like the chief wife, but it's more likely that she was a queen mother. And because there is some implication that he had married the widow of Nebuchadnezzar to try to legitimize his throne, that's probably who this was. Again, we don't know, but it was probably Nebuchadnezzar's widow. And so she's the queen, but she's not really, she's just there in kind of a formal sense to legitimize his throne and not somebody that he really consorts with. Jonathan? Yeah. Come in. That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah. Either not invited, or another possibility because the way she talks to him is she didn't want to come. So, and it could be either one of those. But she wasn't there, whether it was by choice or because she wasn't invited. So it's possible it's his widow, because again, remember, there's 6 years difference between Nabonidus, who is the official king, when he became king, and when Nebuchadnezzar had died. So it was only a 6-year window there. So it's very possible it was Nebuchadnezzar's widow, because there's some indication of that. She also addresses him in a way that likely a wife would not be able to, because she seems to be kind of direct with her words. Maybe I'm reading a little tone into it, but she doesn't address him typically the way you would expect a woman underneath the king in that day and time to address him. It's possible also that it's not Nebuchadnezzar's widow, but it is a wife of Nabonidus. So Nabonidus is the king, and he's second in command, so it's possible she's the queen mother, but not the wife of the widow of Nebuchadnezzar. And remember, we do know that Nabonidus married Nitocris, who was one of the daughters of Nebuchadnezzar. So it's possible this was Nitocris also, Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. But as has been pointed out in chapter 5:11, she clearly knows Daniel. She knows who Daniel is. So that there's a clear connection to Nebuchadnezzar either way. Somehow she is older, she knew Nebuchadnezzar, she knew Daniel, and she says, this guy knows what he's talking about, you need to go get him. And it's also, what she says here is very reminiscent of the words of Nebuchadnezzar back in chapter 4, verse 8, if you look back at that. Nebuchadnezzar there said, at last Daniel came before me. His name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. In him is the spirit of the holy God, and I told the dream before him. So, and then if you look at what she says, In verse 11, there is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. So it's very similar to what Nebuchadnezzar had recorded as well. So let's look at question 3, this queen. And I said in the question, likely the queen mother, gives advice that seems a bit like a reprimand in verses 10 through 12. And I asked what reasons might help explain the nature of her statements. Well, one of them we've talked about. She maybe was around when Nebuchadnezzar was there and Daniel was there, and she's seen all the things that happened. What else? What are some other reasons that you put down there? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because Belshazzar is old enough to be king and left in charge of the whole country, right? And so he was old enough just, a few years ago to have seen all those things that happened. Because how far out are we now? So we're now 23 years after the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, if you look at the dates. Belshazzar was placed in the lead the 10 years prior, so this is the end of his 10 years after Nabonidus had left. So it's only 13 years since the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign was when he became king, or the ruler. So that's pretty close. So you've got to assume if he was even a teenager at that point in time, he's going to have known all the stuff that happened with Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel tells him, and the queen tells him, you knew all this. You should have known this. And so that's another reason she talks to him this way. He should have known this. He saw all the things that happened before. What does Daniel specifically refer to when he's talking to him about what he should have known? He's referring to something that we just talked about in the last chapter. Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar being crazy, right? Just losing his mind and acting like an animal and then coming back and being king. And Daniel says, you should have known that. You saw that. And so clearly Belshazzar was around to see all those things, and so that's probably part of what she's referring to is you should have known this, because Daniel does the same thing. Mm-hmm. This is beneath us, yes. Yeah. And I think what we'll talk about in the next class, but Daniel seems to have that same attitude. He's not impressed with this guy. Also, the queen repeats, and I think going along with that, the queen repeats to him, how does she word it? And then in the days of your father, and she goes on and says, and King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king. I mean, he knows who Nebuchadnezzar is, but she says, your father Nebuchadnezzar the king. So she kind of emphasizes that. So I think it goes along with what Jenny's saying. She's looking at it thinking, Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't have done this. He would have known who to contact. He wouldn't have handled himself this way. He wouldn't have done what you're doing. And so it seems to be there's some disdain in her response to him as well. That this is not the way a king acts. This is not in the nature of Nebuchadnezzar who built this country up. What's another reason that she talks to him this way? Should he have known about Daniel? I mean, what's one of the responsibilities of anybody in charge to who they surround themselves with? Who should they surround themselves with? The wisest, the best advisors, right? And if you've got a guy like Daniel and you ignore him and leave him out in the wings and let somebody else advise you, I mean, he knew about Daniel. He's been around. He should have actually kept him in the inner circle instead of just leaving him out with everybody else. So she kind of is maybe implying that as well, that Daniel stood out above everybody else to the point that Nebuchadnezzar had made him chief of everybody. We don't know his age, huh? It's not recorded in any of the stuff that I've read anyway as far as how old he was when he became king, but old enough that his father would leave and leave him in charge of everything. So probably at least late teenage years when he started, and probably older than that, but that's supposition. I like the wording in the New King James when she describes Daniel. She says that he understands enigmas. Other translations say problems or difficult problems. I like that word enigma, because a problem just, we look at lots of things, that's a problem, but we can figure it out. What's an enigma mean? Yeah, it literally means like a knot. It's a joint that can't be untied, and Daniel was able to unknot all these difficult things. So again, she's kind of implying you should have known about Daniel. So we're at the end of class. We got right to the end of the material, so we'll wrap up the chapter on Wednesday. Thanks, everybody.